Um, I thought we'd start initially just to explain what on earth we're doing. Daryl, I suppose it's worth saying that you and I find ourselves in this configuration pretty frequently. So my concern was that I might just jump in and talk to you like I do almost every week. But the smart thing to do would be first to introduce myself and introduce you and explain what we're doing here. So I am Aaron Cassidy. I'm director of the Center for Research in New Music at the University of Huddersfield, which includes running the HCR CD label, Huddersfield Contemporary Records. And I'm here with my very good friend Daryl Buckley, who is the artistic director of ELISION Ensemble. Daryl is in his beautiful house in Melbourne, Australia. I am in our little house in a village called Slowett, west of Huddersfield, sometimes called Slaithwaite, sometimes called Slathwaite, with a very beautiful view of a bunch of trees outside. And I'm here in the office. So the premise for this is our CD label and also the label of our distributor, NMC. We have had to basically shut down production. Lots of planned releases for our label and also for NMC's label have been postponed. Things that were supposed to come out in the spring now, kind of best case scenario, will come out in the autumn, and that has a fairly significant impact on the business. But it also provides an opportunity for us to go back and look at some older releases and explore the back catalog a bit. And so over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to do some conversations like this with a few people, highlighting especially some of the longer term relationships that we have with the label. And ELISION is the obvious place to start. So out of the 23 discs that we've released so far, ELISION is on 4 of them, going back pretty much to the beginning. There was one release that predated the first 2 ELISION discs, but the second and third discs that we did were with you, Transference and Strange Forces, and then a follow-up disc, The Wreck of Former Boundaries, including some pieces of mine, and then most recently Worldline, which came out last year. So Daryl, what I wanted to start with actually was those first 2 discs, which are kind of part of a bigger package, and I wanted you to tell us a little bit about how that all came to be. So there was this link with there's the 2 CDs, a link with King's Place. There's a link as well with Radio Bremen in Germany. How did that all come about?
Well, it's an extremely wild time for the group. It was something of a conflagration because we had been defunded in Australia at the state level, which then kind of led and had consequences for how funding at the federal level. And so Lisa and I and Raf have family. We relocated. The ensemble decided to continue and to hold together and to forge ahead. And so somehow we found ourselves, I guess, flung into Europe and into the UK with a stack of new relationships, not just the existing ones with both Lisa and Richard Barrett, but emerging relationships with both yourself and younger composers such as Tim McCormack. And there we were in Europe, and I guess just out of everything that, out of conflagration comes new beginnings and new growth. And the new growth for us very much lay in the relationship with CeReNeM at Huddersfield University, with being able to manage a concert series at King's Place, which I think began through the kind initiatives of Elaine Mitchener, who was with Recordia at the stage in that time, and that sort of developed. And then we'd also had previously, some decades ago, worked with Marita Emmigholz at Radio Bremen, but there were just a number of things floating around, and they sort of all got flung into the mix and became quite a magical, potent brew, and led to those 2 CDs.
Do you remember even how? Well, I guess I have 2 questions. The link with King's Place seems interesting. That was a very new venue at the time, as I remember,
Yep.
or at least a reasonably new venue. Do you remember how many concerts you did as part of that? It was a few years worth, if I remember right.
Oh, look, I think we did 11 or 12, and actually Lisa and I visited the construction site
Right.
before it, before the, I guess the walls and the fixtures
Yeah.
even took shape. We were there being given a tour, wearing hard hats,
Right.
looking at the progress of the building. So yeah, and Elaine Michener at Recordi was
Yeah.
very proactive in that regard at that time, and I think our very first concert there was in fact a celebration of um, the Recordi publishing house, and so we played work by Lisa, of course, and
Right.
Popper and other Recordi stalwarts. But that then led on to being able to manage a series there, and through support that we still had from reserves that we had built up while we were active in Australia with structural subsidies and through relationships with RMIT, SILE, and just bits and pieces that we're able to garner and put together. We mobilised a regular concert series at King's Place, and that ran for a couple of years, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things for me that was really interesting about that project was the number of different ways that you were approaching documentation. I suppose it's worth mentioning as well. It doesn't have a direct link with the commercial releases on HCR, but also you did quite a lot of videos as part of that relationship with King's Place. I mean, can you talk a little bit about why you approached it with those various different kinds of outputs? So you had a kind of concert series. There were a collection of videos that were also filmed there at King's Place, at least 4 that I can think of. And then also, we'll get to talking about the making the recordings, which didn't happen at King's Place, but we'll talk about that in a second.
Well, I think one of the positive aspects to going through traumatic experience, and in our case it was the defunding, is that you become even more conscious of the need to document and the need to value what you have when you have it, to make absolutely everything count. And I don't believe that ELISION has ever been lacking at all in that regard, and pretty much from the early 90s that was the emphasis and strategic approach and the grid through which I've put through all of our actions. But essentially 2008 onwards, that became even more urgent, and just and when we were in the UK, I just had a extremely heightened consciousness of the preciousness of our relationships with people, because in the end that's what it's boiling down to. You're not actually filming a concert, you're filming your moment in that time with that player playing somebody's work. It's not so it's not even necessarily about the institutional veneer of the event. It's about who you are and who you are with in that time, and documentation breathes life into it. It's not a passive thing, to say the least. It's about being able to breathe life into something and animate that space.
Yeah. So the other little portion of that, I suppose, that triangle is Radio Bremen, and specifically the Zendershall in Bremen. For me, one of the untold stories of those 2 discs. But I guess it's worth saying as well. I mean, how many CDs actually came out of that whole project? I think at least 5 that I can think of. So 2 on our label, Neos, a new one from Evan Johnson, which on Kairos, which has some recordings that came from those years back in 2009 and 10. The untold portion of that story for me is Marita Emmingholtz. Tell us about Marita. Who is she? What is your relationship with her?
Well, I first met Marita through Lisa, of course. Radio Bremen had commissioned Voodoo Child from Lisa in, I don't know, about 1989, and it was performed in 1990, if I recall correctly. And Lisa and I went over, and it was just the most beautiful hall. again, it's another, I guess, act of love in a way to make a hall that is so incredibly special, and the acoustics are so amazing, and that also was a space of which I think there are only 3 such recording venues built in the world, and that, if I understand correctly, was the only, or is still maybe the only surviving one. And it was constructed after World War II. So in a way, it's part of that whole sort of time in world history where the world is re-embracing culture as a way of beginning again. And that was one of the items of those, of building and creation in that time. You know, that was when the hall was built.
Yeah,
and so Marita was this amazing person who just was a strong believer in anything new music, and was really keen to get everyone and anyone to Bremen, and just to make that place special.
Yeah, so we should say that she was an intendant for Radio Bremen, and I can't remember the name of the festival that she ran.
Pro Musica Nova.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess I hadn't really thought about it until you were just giving that explanation, but there are all sorts of things about the situation at Radio Bremen, and especially the Zendes that are pretty applicable to where we are at the moment in this particular time. And tell us a little bit about the link, I suppose, with Radio Bremen and the Zendes Hall, where we did that recording. So it's this amazing venue, this incredible acoustic, but by the time we got there to record in 2009, my memory is that the part of the building that used to be the headquarters of Radio Bremen was a hospital, or a kind of hospice care centre. Yeah,
it had fallen foul of urban renewal, and as councils and governments and institutions plan their future and decide to concentrate resources and in an urban centre, the radio hall, the recording hall, was very much on the outside of Bremen. So that fell foul, if you like, of that replanning process and restructure. So, which is a great shame, because it's one of the few recording halls I've ever been in that you just think to yourself, my God, you know.
Yeah, I mean, everyone I've ever talked to who's been in that space, or certainly recorded in that space, just gushes about it. I mean, it is definitely the best acoustic of any space I've ever been in. It's completely stunning.
Yeah, and Marita managed to gather really good people to work there, and a really great set of recording engineers, and the team of people who were regular there were just really fantastic. So.
And I guess the other element of that whole story, which you kind of alluded to, which seems really important to me, is that those are also all long-term relationships. So these links with Marita or with Radio Bremen or the festival, you know, talking about going back decades already at that point. That was now 10 and 11 years ago that we made those discs. One of the other things that jumps out at me as being unique about those first 2 discs is the instrumentation. So there's in the ensemble disc, or predominantly ensemble pieces in the first one, in Transference. There's some, a few kind of unusual elements about the instrumentation. The second one has a really strong brass focus, brass and winds, and I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that, because for me it's one of the kind of defining features of a particular era of the ensemble's repertoire. Where does it come from?
Yeah, I mean, when I hear that CD, I sometimes feel guilty about the amount of punishment I delivered to Tristan Williams and Benjamin Marks. But I mean, really, their attitude was pretty much like, we're going to climb Mount Everest. How many times do you want us to do it? And so I recall just the King's Place concert, early February. They'd had Barrett work, the duo Aurora, by that days beforehand. And on top of that, they were playing Tim McCormack's dispersed, which really screwed with the chops, I think, for Tristram. And then, you know, you had the Evan Johnson apostrophe duo, which is brutal.
Yeah.
Well,
there's a great photograph that I took from the Radio Bremen sessions, which maybe I'll edit in if I can manage to do it, with Tristram laying on the ground with his flugelhorn next to him like this, just kind of completely spent.
Yeah, yeah, but you know, everyone was really up for it, and in I just. It's really hard to, I don't know, characterise that spirit without sounding glib, but it's just something that then and now still permeates the group, and we've always been fortunate to have players like that, of that calibre, with that attitude.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that celebrates it big time.
Yeah, absolutely. More recently, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about Worldline. So that's the most recent disc that you've done for HCR. Came out late last year, and some similar names. You know, the disc is made of pieces by Richard Barrett and Timothy McCormack and Lisa Lim. So those go all the way back to those early releases in 2009 and 2010, and kind of like a I don't know, a little catch up of where the group is. And one of the big shifts that happens that's interesting for me is the addition of the lap steel guitar, which is your instrument. And tell us a little bit about that. I mean, where does the instrument come from? When do you start playing it? How? I mean, you've obviously built a repertoire now for this instrument. Where did that come from? Where did it start?
Well, Aaron, as you well know, I was slated and scheduled to play a rather beautiful piece of yours for solo electric guitar. And then when we were living in Berlin, I had an injury to my shoulder that my 5-year-old son had managed to tear a bicep and muscle, and so that all had to get operated on and put back, and you know, so in the process of that, it's about 1.5 years of not playing. And so I started to think of, okay, if the journey's going to continue, how can it continue and in what way? And it just seemed to me the lap steel, you know, was a really interesting and great instrument that could be pursued.
Had you played it at all previously? I mean, obviously you had a kind of expanded instrumentarium, as you know, pretty early on. But and any link back through the more kind of let's say kind of vernacular traditions, Hawaiian music or country music or other places where the instrument appears? It was for you always a new music instrument.
It was a new music instrument because I don't think it's often it's really hard to dig back into the mists of time in this way. But I mean, I was very aware of the pedal steel guitar for sure, and I know that at some time before we left Australia, I'd actually spoken to a pedal steel maker, a manufacturer in Brisbane who was extremely highly regarded, and I'd kind of had an idea that, look, I might get an instrument from him, but I believed at that time, like the waiting time was something like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, and he was no longer really interested in doing them. So I was being discouraged by his wife and people close to him. So I didn't go there then. But then I think after the accident and repair of the shoulder, I don't know why I didn't go to pedal steel, but somehow I wound up in an interim. I don't know, somewhere in between the lap steel. But there was a maker I came across in the UK, a guy called David Porterhouse, who seemed really fabulous and were able to work on a custom instrument that was discussed between he and I and Richard Barrett. And, you know, that was really quite amazing.
What are the custom elements?
Custom elements are to actually have three legs. So you have tripod, which gives it stability, which is absolutely essential in Tim McCormack's duo, for instance, where you can have the possibility of two people performing upon the instrument at the same time, and have a very complicated interplay of four hands competing with one another for space and territory, and intruding and disrupting upon one another. That would not be possible if you were to play the instrument traditionally with it sitting in your lap. That was one of the modifications. The other one was using a series of benders that Duesenberg make and having them installed. And so I could raise and lower pitch on three of the strings.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about Tim's piece anyway, so I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I know because of our exchanges back and forth during the recording process that was a real challenging piece to record for a variety of reasons. Some of it just about the instability of the instrument. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What is it that's happening in that piece? Why does it sound like it sounds?
I still can't completely answer that, because a lot of the magic, and I'm not using that word loosely, lies in setting up a really unpredictable territory where just behaviours are going to do things wildly depending upon tension, who does what, which of the four hands might rest with a little bit more or a little bit less pressure, or be slightly one way or another, or whatever. There's so many variabilities, that all of which are subtle, that can produce some incredibly incredible range of results that are often at odds with one another. You know, and so often each performance is still the same work. You can identify it, but often there have been some wonderful things that have happened in one that don't happen in another. And I've spent a lot of time trying to work out some of that and quantify some of that, which I can do to a certain extent, but, you know, past a certain point, it's all in the lap of the gods, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that that's a kind of thread through quite a lot of the ensemble's work, a kind of unpredictability or instability, or high levels of difficulty where you know, repeating at a similarly high level with similar results is challenging or highly unlikely. And I guess I'm curious about where recording comes in. So thinking about making a CD, making a recording. How do you navigate those two things of the kind of fixed nature of a recording, especially a studio recording, with work that has that level of instability or unpredictability?
Yeah, look, there is no formula. It's always a blow by blow conversation between players and the composer, and on the particular work at hand. With respect to substance, really, Tim was there at least for the first 20, close to the first 20 minutes of material that's been released, and we did it in very, very, very large sections, and so it just becomes a matter of which take do you prefer, or you feel captures something really quite unique in that moment. When you go to the second section, particularly with the EBO, there's just so many possibilities on a detuned string with respect to tension, gauge, position, probably the strength of the magnet in the EBO on the day, the alloy that makes up the guitar string, sweat on the hand, humidity in the air, God knows. There's just so many things that you're at a point where it's not just about the perfection or imagined perfection that comes from the player undertaking a certain action precisely. You're also at a point where things of necessity can't quite work consistently 100% the same way all the time, you know.
Yeah.
And it's about embracing that, because in that there's going to be some terribly interesting things that do occur.
Yeah, I mean, and that for me is one of the things that becomes really interesting in the recording process. That what you're trying to do is capture that essence. So not necessarily one particular version of one of those outcomes which you think is somehow the best, but somehow
Yeah,
getting that sense that you've frozen that feeling kind of in time.
yeah.
Um,
Absolutely, and the same thing with Worldline as well. Again, it's, you know, some of the movements are more tightly edited than others, but the emphasis is on trying to get the energy and the flow.
yeah. One last question, and then we'll wrap it up. I mean, one of the things that jumps out at me across the conversation. So we have. I'm just trying to kind of like make a reference to. So you've mentioned Brisbane, Melbourne, Berlin. I think we certainly talked about Huddersfield, but you were living in Manchester at the time. London and King's Place, Bremen, and then a bunch of composers from the US. As we were talking a couple of days ago, you talked about the Asian Diaspora, which really jumped out at me as a perfect description for the nature of the group. And we haven't even mentioned so far the fact that these players, of course, didn't all move to Huddersfield or Manchester. The players were just as scattered as they always have been, coming from pretty much every corner. Lots, obviously, from Australia, but also people from the US and from Germany. Just talk a little bit about how that comes to be. I mean, it's basically an international ensemble, which obviously is particularly challenging at this moment in in world history. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about the Asian Diaspora.
Look, it's pretty much embedded in our DNA, going right back to the beginning. Because growing up in Australia as an ensemble in the late 80s, there were a lot of amazing musicians at hand, but when somebody decided to move, say, for instance, from Melbourne to Sydney in those days, generally they were lost, you know, to the practice in Melbourne. So they moved, and I think we had a fabulous bass player, Keith Boersma, and I decided, look, I wanted to still try and work with Keith, even though he was going up to Sydney to work with Sydney Symphony and Australian Chamber Orchestra. So I decided I still wanted to fly him down, and we would bear the cost, because the loss to the ensemble of the expertise and the loss to the ensemble of the social relationship was worth it. And it just started, and it just kept on getting bigger. So, you know, within about 10 years, you know, everyone's living everywhere, and, you know, I started spending my life as a travel agent.
Yeah, and I mean, to kind of put it in the current context, how do you imagine the current travel restrictions and lockdowns and all the rest will affect the ensemble over the next few months, years?
Look, now I think it's a time to emphasise social cohesion within the ensemble. So we're having a weekly set of, if you like, private meetings between members of the group and particular composers whose music we're working on. I'm going to keep those running. But essentially now is a time for us to be a little bit quiet, and which enables us time as well to prepare, to practice. You know, I know certain members are undertaking some really, really difficult performance projects at the moment that need months of sort of time to be able to sort of get repertoire like that underneath your fingers. So there's a productive aspect to this kind of time, both with the sorts of repertoire you can start to prepare for when you come out on the other side, in terms of planning, engagement. We've been through not times like this, but as an Australian ensemble, we've been through a number of times where we've had to shift base, from Victoria into New South Wales, from New South Wales into Queensland, Queensland to Germany and Berlin, and then back to Brisbane, and then to the UK, and then back to Melbourne. So we've managed to navigate and learn resilience in all of this. And so I'm reasonably optimistic that we will maintain our resilience and cohesion and come out the other side performing concerts as soon as we can.
And making some more records for HCR.
Yeah.
Daryl, it was great to talk to you as always. Thank you very, very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Thank you.
Right.
Okay. Bye.